All right, so we're going to start talking about one of my favorite chapters, which is civil liberties. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to break down in terms of the protections given to us by the Bill of Rights. So what we're going to do today is kind of introduce the Bill of Rights and then break down the First Amendment. There's so much in the First Amendment, we could probably spend an entire week on it, but we'll just go over the highlights of the First Amendment today. Okay, so what exactly are civil liberties? They're basically the balance between government power and restraint. It's basically protections from the government. So it's protections from government overreach, from an abuse of powers. So there's a balance between what the government needs to do and protecting us from government overreach. But civil liberties are really caught in a catch-22. Are any of you familiar with a catch-22? Not really? Okay. So a catch-22 is essentially you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You can't win for trying. So obviously we need to keep the government in check. But the government also has to be able to protect us from threats, both domestic and foreign, protect us from terrorism, mass shootings, crime. So the question really is, how much power is too much power? And in the post 9/11 era, the balance between government protection and the erosion of civil liberties has really become difficult. It's hard to see the line between government protection and government overreach. The invasive nature of body scans at airports, wiretapping without a warrant, seen as necessary for protection, but the violation of our civil liberties. So it's a complicated balancing act. And the Bill of Rights originally wasn't necessarily going to be in the Constitution. Some of the founding fathers thought, it's redundant, we don't need it. But it makes sense that we would clearly outline what our rights are, how we can be protected from the government. So, of course, the Bill of Rights became a fundamental part of our Constitution. And one of the biggest rights that's actually in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution is the right of habeas corpus. You cannot be thrown in jail indefinitely without a trial. You have to be charged. You have to be brought before a judge and formally charged. There has to be a trial. If there's not enough evidence, they have to let you go. You can't be thrown in jail for 8 years on a murder trial, which unfortunately happened in Louisiana. A man was in jail for 8 years without a trial on a felony, and they had to drop the charges because this was a clear violation of habeas corpus. You have to be charged, and you have to be brought to trial in a timely manner. That is a fundamental right that we have. It also is referred to as the no body, no proof concept, right? It's hard to charge someone with a crime if you don't have the evidence. So a kind of literal example of this is a famous case involving a man named Robert Durst. He's the subject of a very interesting documentary called The Jinx. He was accused of killing his neighbor here in Texas and then cutting up his body and disposing of it. They found most of the guy's body, but they couldn't find the proof that the guy had been murdered. So Robert Durst was able to argue it was self-defense. He panicked and cut up the body. because they couldn't prove murder, they charged him with illegal disposal of a corpse and got him on that. So the idea is if the evidence isn't there, you can't just throw charges at someone and hope they stick. You can't manufacture evidence. You can't try someone for a crime that maybe didn't happen. So the right to habeas corpus is a fundamental right that we've always had. And then in the end of the documentary To Change, Robert Durst went into a bathroom, forgot he had a microphone on, and basically talked to himself and confessed to killing 2 people and then went to jail for that. So there you go. Okay. Originally, the Supreme Court said that the Bill of Rights only limits the federal government, that it does not apply to the states. So if your right to free speech was limited by the state government, too bad. Eventually, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court first expanded protection from the state government in the form of eminent domain, which is the seizure of property, and later said it is designed to protect us from state violations of our rights, that the Bill of Rights applies to every level of government. But despite this, our civil liberties weren't expanded by the courts till about 100 years ago. Freedom of speech was not a fundamental right until 1925. Freedom of the press was guaranteed in 1931, and freedom of assembly in 1939. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we got protections from self-incrimination and the right to a lawyer. So some of these rights that we sometimes take for granted, these civil liberties, haven't been around that long. We're talking less than 100 years. There were also questions about how the states incorporated parts of the Constitution. Originally, they would incorporate parts of it, but not all of it. So this was called selective incorporation, picking and choosing which rights were guaranteed by the states. And so, eventually, with the 14th Amendment, the decision was made that every part of the federal Constitution has to be incorporated by the states. That they can't pick and choose which parts of the Constitution they're going to enforce. That they have to abide by every protection given to us in the Constitution. All right, so before we move on, just want to do a general knowledge test on the Bill of Rights. So you can tell me what's our rights under the First Amendment. Freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. What about the Second Amendment? Yep, Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms. Yep. The Third Amendment, which I've only had one student ever get because we almost never use it. The Third Amendment basically says we can't be forced to quarter soldiers in our houses during peacetime. So you can't be forced to allow a soldier to stay in your home during peacetime. Okay, what about the Fourth Amendment? All right, the Fourth Amendment protects us from illegal search and seizure. That's where they have to get a search warrant to go into your house. Fifth Amendment? Somewhat, yeah. The right to remain silent, yeah. The Fifth Amendment, yeah, no, you are on the right track. The right to remain silent, to plead the Fifth, to not incriminate yourself, yeah. Sixth Amendment? Okay, the Sixth Amendment guarantees us the right to a lawyer. So if you are arrested, you have the right to ask for a lawyer, and one will be provided for you. The Seventh Amendment gives us the right to a trial by jury in civil cases. So if you're involved in a lawsuit, you can ask for a trial by jury instead of a decision by a judge. The Eighth Amendment protects us from cruel and unusual punishment. So, for example, you can't be executed for shoplifting or tortured, things like that. The Ninth Amendment essentially says these aren't the only rights we have. The rights listed here aren't the only rights we have. And the 10th Amendment is what gives states their powers. Any power not given to the federal government goes to the states. So next week is Constitution Week. The Political Science Department here, we're going to hand out pocket copies of the Constitution. This is my pocket copy. It's from the ACLU. I like this one because not only does it have, sorry, for people online too, the Constitution, it also has a section in the back for what to do if you get pulled over by the police or detained. What to do if you're at a protest that turns violent, things like that. So fundamental knowledge of our rights, which is very, very important. And I'll be handing out some cards next week to you guys that'll have basic information on what to do if you're stopped by the cops and things like that. Because it's important to know this information, and we don't always know what our rights are in a certain situation. Thank you. Yeah. All right, so we're going to break down the First Amendment today and its various components. And of course, the First Amendment guarantees us freedom of religion. And one of the most important parts of the First Amendment is the Establishment Clause. Our government cannot establish an official church or an official religion. This is because in Great Britain, the head of the Church of England is the monarch. So it's the king or the queen. And members of the clergy serve in Parliament. So we didn't want an official church tied to the government. So when people sometimes make comments like, oh, well, we're a Christian nation, not officially, right? We don't have an official religion. We recognize the right to practice any religion without the government establishing an official religion. And over time, of course, we've had the debate over the separation between church and state. And it was Thomas Jefferson who said that the government has to be secular in its approach, that we can't promote religion on the government level. So he was the one who argued that the government should not be tied to religion, that they shouldn't be involved in promoting religion or religious practices. Now, of course, what that means is up for debate, right? There are some people who argue that the separation between church and state just means an official religion, whereas others will argue you can't push your religious beliefs and try to make it a law, right? You can't mandate that everybody carry a Bible with them. And so because of this establishment clause, because of the idea of the separation of church and state, we have seen the Supreme Court taking action on school prayer. And school prayer, by the way, refers to public schools. Private religious schools, the rules don't apply. But in public schools, you can't have Bible readings during classes or a prayer announced over the loudspeaker before a football game. Things like that are considered a violation of the separation of church and state. It's a way of protecting religious minorities. If you're a Muslim student and they want you to recite the Bible in class, that's the problem. So the idea is schools are to be secular in their approach. You can have after-school Bible club or something like that, as long as it's voluntary. And the government is allowed to take some action towards religion. They are allowed to provide aid to religious schools as long as they are not advancing religion, becoming entangled with religion, and the government is secular in its approach. So essentially what this means is, if you allow for a Christian organization on a college campus, you also have to allow a Jewish student organization or a Muslim student organization. If you open the door for one, you have to open the door for the others. You can't pick and choose which religions get a student club or an after-school activity. So if you open the door for one, you have to open the door for others. There's also, of course, the debate over the phrase, "under God in the Pledge of Allegiance." This was not originally part of the Pledge of Allegiance. It was actually added in the 1950s in response to the so-called godless communists in the Soviet Union. So there have been atheist organizations that have sued to get the phrase removed. It's allowed to stay because the court has essentially said, you're not defining which God it is, right? You're not saying this specific God. So because it's non-denominational, it's allowed. And also, you can't force a student to recite the Pledge of Allegiance anyway, so if an atheist student doesn't want to, you can't make them. So it's fine. It's allowed to stay in. What's not allowed sometimes are displays of particular religious icons or documents. So there's been two major cases discussing if the Ten Commandments can be displayed in public. In the Van Orden case, here in Texas, the Ten Commandments are part of a larger display outside the state capitol that includes the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and so on. So that is allowed to stay because it's part of a larger display, and because it's outside, it's fine. In Kentucky, however, the county was posting the Ten Commandments inside the courthouses by themselves. That's not allowed, because basically that's establishment of a religion. And so in this case, the county was told you have to take down the display. It can't be a standalone display inside a courthouse. There's also been lawsuits in states like Oklahoma. They put up the Ten Commandments outside the state capitol. So a satanic temple put up a satanic statue right next to it. and they got told you have to take it down. So they went to court, and the court said, you opened the door for one religion, you opened the door for all of them. So you either have to leave the statue up, or you have to take down both. So if you open the door for the display of one religion, you have to open the door for the others. So either put up with the satanic statue or take them both down. All right, another important provision in the First Amendment is the free exercise clause. We have the right to believe and practice our particular religion. So you can wear a crucifix, or a yarmulke, or a hijab, or a pentacle. You can go to a mosque, or a cathedral, or a synagogue, right? Because the idea is you have the right to practice and believe what you want, and that cannot be taken away from you. And we've seen issues with this popping up in various ways. In the 1940s, there were issues around the fact that there were Jehovah's Witness children who would not recite the Pledge of Allegiance in school. In the religion, Jehovah's Witnesses are not allowed to pledge allegiance to any state or nation. About 10,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were killed in the Holocaust because they refused to pledge allegiance to Nazi Germany. Here in the U.S., the children were being expelled from school, and the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you can't do that. Their religion does not allow them to pledge allegiance. Therefore, you have to grant them an exemption. You cannot force a student to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. This goes for pretty much any student. Can you have it? Yes. Can you ask students to do it? Yes. Can you force them? No. You can't. We've also seen issues with the treatment of Muslim Americans. They are, statistically speaking, a religious minority, but they faced some challenges, especially post 9/11, when hate crimes against Muslim Americans went up. So in two separate cases, the court has had to establish the right to freedom of religious exercise for Muslim Americans. In the Holt case, a prisoner in Arkansas wanted to grow a beard as part of his practice of Islam. It's strongly urged within Islam that men grow a beard. But the prison had a policy that prisoners were not allowed to have facial hair. So he sued, and he won. The Supreme Court said it is part of his religion, it is religious exercise, you have to make an exception. You have to give him the right to freely practice his religion. In the Abercrombie case, a Muslim woman had applied for a job, and she was denied because she wears a hijab, and they said it violated the dress code. Within Islam, there are three types of head coverings for women. The hijab covers the hair and part of the neck. The niqab covers all of the face and head except for the eyes. And then the most extreme kind is the burqa, where it covers everything and there's just like a mesh screen so women can see out. So most Muslim women in the US wear, if they wear any kind of head covering, it's the hijab. It's the covering of the hair. So she was told her hijab violated the company's dress code policy. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sued the corporation on her behalf, and she won. It's religious exercise. You can't tell her that she has to take off her hijab to work there. She has the right to wear one as part of her religious practice. So a more humorous example of this is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And yes, this is a real church. I'm going to show you this. This usually gets students going. It's pretty funny. Okay. Welcome to the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Yeah. So they call themselves Pastafarians, and as you can see here, they're a colander on their head. And they have sued for the right to wear a colander on their head in driver's license photos. And they have won. Yes. They call themselves Pastafarians. And this is a legitimate church. They also will dress up like pirates to get married. Let me see. Yeah. They have to dress up like pirates when they get married in the church. I'll show you more. So that's them in a parade with a flying spaghetti monster. Colanders, and then I was trying to see if there's a really good photo of them in their pirate getup. But yeah, it's considered an official religion, and as you can see at the top here, you can become ordained as a Pastafarian minister. Not hurting anyone, right? So why not? They have a special section of their website devoted to hate mail. So, I mean, it's kind of silly, but it's not hurting anyone, right? So why not let them wear a colander and dress up like pirates to marry? Yeah, freedom of expression. Also things like in military cemeteries for a while, they weren't allowing other religious symbols like the crescent moon for Islam, a pentacle for pagan soldiers. So eventually they had to grant that right. So on a headstone, you can now see a Star of David, a crucifix, a pentacle, basically just establishing that there are multiple religions and they can be, could be identified as well. Okay. The next part, of course, of the First Amendment is freedom of speech. And essentially, the way it works is that the burden of proof is on the government to restrict speech. So it's not up to us to say we have the right to say it. It's up to the government to say that we don't have the right to say it. So the burden of proof isn't on us necessarily, it's on the government. Now there is a test of sorts that was created by the Supreme Court that's called the clear and present danger test. Basically, if the speech presents a genuine threat or danger to society, it is not considered protected speech. So the famous example used by the Supreme Court is shouting fire in a crowded theater. You walk into a movie theater on opening night, the theater's jam-packed, and you yell fire when there isn't one. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of chaos. Another example would be if you walk up to TSA and you say, TSA sucks, that's protected speech. But if you get into line for TSA and you yell, I have a bomb, and everybody panics, that's not protected, right? Because you could incite a riot, people could get injured or killed. So if it clearly incites violence or some type of danger, it is not protected speech. However, the court did make it clear in Brandenburg that unless the speech could directly incite violence, you can't prohibit it. In the Brandenburg case, Brandenburg was a KKK leader addressing a rally who essentially said, we have to take action if the government doesn't stop suppressing the white race. Now, he wasn't armed, but a couple of his followers were, so he was arrested. But the court said he didn't incite violence directly, right? He didn't say kill federal government officials, he just said take action. That could be anything from letter writing to protesting. There's nothing inherently violent in saying take action. So they overturned his conviction. You have to essentially be outright calling for violence for it to be banned. So if you go on Twitter and you threaten to kill the president, you better bet you're getting a meeting with local law enforcement, possibly Secret Service, right? But if you just go on Twitter and you say the president sucks, that's protected, right? As long as you're not directly invoking violence, threatening violence, inciting violence, your right to free speech can't be taken away. We've also seen an interesting change in how free speech works with political campaigns. It used to be the case that you couldn't run an ad 60 days before an election where you mentioned your opponent by name. Obviously, that's no longer the case. Also, with the Citizens United decision in 2010, the Supreme Court said that corporations are people in terms of freedom of speech, and so you can't ban them from donating to campaigns. So this opened the door for massive amounts of money to be spent on campaigns. In 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney spent a combined $4 billion on the presidential election. Yeah. And between August and November of 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent a combined $1 billion in 3 months. Because there's no real restrictions on campaign finance anymore. You want to run for president, you either have to be a millionaire or damn good at fundraising. Any questions? Okay, any questions online? Okay. All right, fighting words, basically obscene speech that could directly incite violence. Largely it's allowed. People are going to take offense at certain things that are said. And on the one hand, you don't want people running around in public yelling fuck repeatedly. On the other hand, you can't really stop them from doing so. Right? If you walk up to a cop and you call him a pig and he punches you, then that's a problem, right? Obviously, it should be handled in a non-violent way. But where we see a bit of an issue is over hate speech, right? Speech that is considered offensive to minorities is protected. If someone walks up to an African American woman in a grocery store in Arkansas and calls her the N-word, that's protected speech. It's offensive, and of course people are going to be outraged by it, but she can't be arrested for saying that, right? You can't be arrested for calling someone a derogatory term. Basically, it's allowed, and that's where we get into the issue of freedom of speech versus censorship, right? Political correctness versus the right to say whatever you want. Now, speech is not protected if it constitutes sexual harassment. Sexual harassment can be both physical and verbal. So if your boss says to you, you have to have sex with me or I'm going to fire you, that's not protected speech. Or if your coworkers make sexual comments about your appearance or jokes that are really, really terrible, you can report them for that. Sexual harassment is not protected speech. But the courts have also said, by and large, that hate speech will be broadly protected. In the RAV case, there was a bit of an epidemic of cross-burning on the lawns of African American families. So the city of St. Paul banned cross-burning. Now the Supreme Court came back and said you can't do that because it's directed at some groups but not all. So unfortunately, you cannot ban cross-burning. Now, you can go after them for arson or destruction of property or trespassing, but you can't outright ban cross-burning or leaving a piece of pork on the outside of a mosque. What's cross-burning? Basically, where they take a wooden cross and light it on fire outside the house. Yeah, outside the house of an African American family. It was used during the civil rights movement as an intimidation tactic. Like, we know where you live, and next time it could be your house kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, an actual, like, wooden cross. Yeah. Yeah. Now, if you do something like graffiti a mosque, which has happened, or try to set it on fire, obviously that's not protected. But, I mean, if you come in one day and someone's left ham on the door, I mean, there's not much you can do about that. It's appalling, of course, it's disgusting, but it's not really something you can go after them for. And recently there was a case in Brownsville. There's a Unitarian Universalist church where people wrote all sorts of anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic graffiti on the side of it, like go home and stuff like that. And I mean, obviously, like if they find those people, they go after them for property damage, but otherwise there's not much you can do about that. Yeah, it is. Okay. The book doesn't discuss free speech in high schools, which I think is a bit of an oversight, because it is important to at least mention. The Tinker case involved a family in Des Moines where the children would go to school wearing a black armband with a peace sign on it to protest the Vietnam War. And they were told, if you do this again, we're going to expel you from school. So they sued, and the Supreme Court said high school students do have the right to some free speech, but the right to free speech doesn't end at the school door. That you can wear an armband in protest, or a Trump 2020 t-shirt, a Biden shirt, Black Lives Matter t-shirt, and you can't get into trouble for that. It also protects the rights of high school students to protest. After the shooting in Parkland, Florida, at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018, there were a lot of coordinated walkouts by students sick of gun violence. And by and large, the policy is that's allowed. Students are allowed to protest. You can't suspend them from taking part in these types of activities. So the students were allowed to walk out, and I was still in Florida at the time. There's actually high school students who walked from one high school over to Marjory Stoneman Douglas to protest. There were a lot of walkouts. So that's allowed. They have the right to some free speech. Now, they're not allowed to advocate for drug use, like the kids who held up the Bong Hits for Jesus banner. That's not going to go over well. And they can't make sexually suggestive speech. But by and large, if they want to protest or circulate a petition or talk about an election, that's protected. They have some of the same fundamental rights. Obviously, there are restrictions, like you can search their lockers and stuff, but the right to free speech doesn't end simply because they're in junior high or high school. There's also protections for commercial speech. Newspapers didn't used to be allowed to run an ad for a lawyer or a doctor. That changed. In terms of tobacco products, obviously we don't see ads on television anymore for cigarettes, not really in newspapers, but magazines can run ads for tobacco products, vaping, things like that. Also alcohol, magazines can run alcohol ads if they want. There's also some debate about whether or not to provide information about how to obtain an abortion. When abortion was legalized in 1973, abortion providers wanted to advertise in newspapers and in the phone book so people could know where they could get an abortion. And at first, there was pushback, but then the court said it's a legal service, they have the right to run an ad if they want. So you can run an ad for your business. You can share information about contraception clinics, access to abortion, things like that. Okay, symbolic speech is also protected under the First Amendment. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court had to tackle the issue of flag burning. In 1984, at the Republican National Convention in Texas, protesters burned a flag in their opposition to the Reagan administration, and they were arrested for this. Their conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had said that flag burning is protected as symbolic speech under the First Amendment. So you cannot be arrested for burning a flag in protest. Shortly after that, Congress tried to pass or create a constitutional amendment to ban flag burning, but it's never really gotten anywhere. And even if Congress tried to propose it, the court would look at them and say, we've already ruled on this, you can't try to circumvent us. Obviously, you don't want to be filming yourself burning a flag, but you are allowed to do. That is considered symbolic speech. The Supreme Court has also had to tackle very controversial groups and protests. The Westboro Baptist Church, and I use the term church here very lightly, is essentially one family from Kansas who shows up to funerals with really, really offensive signs. They'll go to the funerals of soldiers and hold up signs like "Thank God for dead soldiers," "God hates fags," really awful things like that. They got their start protesting at the funeral for Matthew Shepard, who was a young man in Laramie, Wyoming, who was beaten and left tied to a fence and died in 1998. Westboro Baptist Church showed up to his funeral holding up signs that said things like "Matthew Shepard entered hell" and the date of his death, things like that. They were also planning to go and protest outside the Pulse nightclub after the shooting in 2016 and managed to get talked out of that. But the court has upheld their right to do so. They said, is it offensive? Yeah, but they have the right. And more than one member of the family is a lawyer, so they're careful to make sure they have the permits, and that if there is some kind of skirmish, they're not the ones who start it. They're careful about kind of staying where they need to. And usually, when they show up, there's plenty of counter-protesters. So when people heard that they were going to show up to Matthew Shepard's funeral, a whole bunch of people put on angel wings and formed a barrier so the family didn't have to look at them going in and out of the church. Yeah. So there will be counter-protesters when they show up. And you are allowed to take part in what's called Speech Plus. You are allowed to picket, to hold up signs, to do what's called a die-in, where people act like dead bodies to draw attention to the cause. So that's allowed. You're allowed to hold up signs and protest. Now, there are some restrictions on this. You can't protest on private property unless you get permission from the owner. You have to get a permit usually to protest through a city. And you can be denied a permit on the grounds of safety. So the first white supremacist march through Virginia, where the young woman was killed by a guy who ran her over with his car. When they came back the next year, that group, and wanted to protest, to march again, the state of Virginia said, no, people died last time, this is too violent, we're not going to let you do this. So sometimes, on safety grounds, they just won't allow a protest to happen. And we've seen, of course, a lot of protests for Black Lives Matter. But recently, a study showed that something like 93% of the protests have been peaceful. There's just been that small percentage where we see the violence. And here in the valley, there was supposed to be a protest in McAllen that got postponed. And so a handful of people showed up, and this guy with a chainsaw went running through the protesters. Yeah, that was pretty scary. The next weekend, the protest went forward in Edinburgh, and it was calm, it was peaceful. There wasn't any violence or anything like that. So if it's peaceful, great. If it turns violent, that's when you got to crack down a little bit. There's also issues with things like protesting in front of an abortion clinic. It is allowed, but with certain caveats. They're not allowed within 10 feet of the front door, and they're not allowed to physically grab anyone walking into the clinic. This is a bit contentious, of course, because on the one hand, if you're walking into Planned Parenthood for contraception and someone yells "baby killer" at you, that's a little bit unsettling. On the other hand, they do have the right to protest. So what most clinics do is they have volunteers who will escort people in and out of the clinic so they're not facing a little bit of a hostile crowd situation. If it gets to be too much, they can start kind of pushing back and being like, you guys can't do this, you're scaring people. You can't grab the women, you can't physically threaten them, you gotta take it back a notch. Okay, so the last component of the First Amendment is freedom of the press. And essentially, the Supreme Court has said you can't bar a newspaper from publishing anything they want, especially if it's in the interest of the public, barring extraordinary circumstances. So if you wanted to prevent the New York Times from publishing a schedule of when we'd next be bombing ISIS, okay, you might be able to get away with doing that. But if they're publishing something about the fight with ISIS, you can't really stop them from doing so. And this was definitely an issue with the Pentagon Papers. In the early 1970s, top secret Defense Department documents were illegally given to journalists at the New York Times. And what these papers said was the death toll in Vietnam is higher than the government is saying. The war is not going that well. And also told the American people that the Nixon administration was going to start bombing Cambodia as well. So the administration tried to prevent the publication of the documents, and the court said, you can't do that. The public has a right to know this information. They have the right to know what's going on with the war. The Pentagon Papers showed that the government had been lying to the people since the start of the war. And it's really because of Vietnam and Watergate that the American people lost trust in the government. Finding out they'd been lying to us about a war just really hit people the wrong way. They couldn't believe the government was lying to them about this. On the other hand, while freedom of the press is guaranteed, there's no constitutional protections for journalists themselves. By and large, they are allowed to publish what they want. But it gets really tricky when they're using a confidential source, and that confidential source reveals information that's damaging to the government. If a journalist is required by a court to turn over the identity of a confidential source, and they choose not to, they will go to jail for contempt of court. And journalists have been jailed for refusing to reveal the identity of a confidential source. Now, journalists like confidential sources. Woodward and Bernstein found out about Watergate from a source they named Deep Throat, who wasn't identified until the 90s, shortly before he died as an FBI employee. They want the information to be anonymous, right? They didn't want this person to end up getting into trouble at work. They want protection for government whistleblowers. But there have been cases where the name of the person has to be revealed. So an example of this is from the George W. Bush administration. There was a woman named Valerie Plame. She was an undercover CIA operative, and her husband, Joe Wilson, was a member of Congress. So her husband criticized the Bush administration going to war in Iraq in public. In retaliation, someone who worked for the Bush administration outed Valerie Plame to a newspaper that published who she was, her undercover identity, and where she was working. Big problem, right? She had to be pulled from the field because otherwise she would have been killed. So of course, they wanted to know who basically almost got her killed. So the journalist at first refused to identify her, went to jail, identify the source, right? Eventually revealed that it was a man named Scooter Libby who did it in retaliation, and then he went to jail. So something like that, there's not going to be protections for the journalist because she could have died. And the whole CIA operation was blown to hell because they had to pull her out of the field. So something like that, that's not going to be protected. But something like a whistleblower saying recently the State Department was asking us to cover up sensitive intelligence information, that's going to be protected. there are some other limits on the free press. If a journalist publishes something that they know isn't true, it's considered libel. So if you write a story that not only is false, but you know it's false and you write it anyway, this is considered libel. So there was a tabloid that had written a story saying Melania Trump was a call girl when she first got to the U.S. They didn't have proof of that, of course, so they got sued for libel and lost. But you have to prove that the journalist knew the information was false. So if a journalist publishes a story in good faith, believing the sources are valid, that's not libel. If they publish a story knowing it's false and the information is false and they don't care, then it's libel. So you have to prove that they knew the story was false. Slander is even more difficult to prove. Basically, if you say something derogatory or defamatory about a person, but how do you prove that? Unless there's an audio recording, how do you prove that they said this? So slander is even harder to prove. Unless someone's dumb enough to get caught on tape saying it, it becomes a he said, she said, and it'll never get anywhere. There's also been some controversy over the rules about third-party posting. Congress essentially has said internet companies that basically are a holding place for people to post, you can't sue them. So companies like eBay or Amazon, where there's third-party merchandise, you can't sue them. You can sue the company that posted the information, but not Amazon. So a kind of sad example of this is there was a website for a long time called Backpage. And what it did was it was a way for sex workers to offer their services online. Rather than having to be out on the streets, they could reach customers through the internet. What was happening, though, was sex traffickers were selling underage girls through Backpage for sex. So when some of these girls managed to get free, they tried to sue Backpage for facilitating their sale. And the court said you can't sue Backpage. They're not responsible for what your traffickers posted. Should they do something about it? Yeah, but you can't sue them. You could only sue the traffickers. So Backpage pledged to try and keep underage posting from happening, and eventually they went out of business. But the women couldn't sue them because they're not the ones who posted them for sale. So you can't go after a company for something like that. We also see discussions about pornography. There's a famous quote where a Supreme Court justice, when he was asked to define pornography, said, "I know it when I see it." Right? It's kind of a pretty good definition. There's no limits on things like adult bookstores, sex shops, things like that. There are limits, of course, on child pornography. Child pornography is completely illegal. The sale, making, transferring child pornography will get you into some serious trouble. There's also limits on what they call a snuff film. A snuff film is basically where someone is murdered on camera. Obviously, that's illegal, and the sale, producing, transferring of that will also get you into some major trouble. So an example of this is there's a documentary on Netflix called Don't Fuck with Cats, and it's about citizen journalists who went after this sociopath in Canada. Because he had posted a video on YouTube of him killing kittens, and so of course people were outraged by that, and then he posted a couple more videos of him killing kittens, and then eventually he posted on the dark web a video of him killing a man in a hotel room. And because of citizen journalism, they're actually able to track him down, and now he's in jail. So stuff like that is illegal, obviously. Getting rid of it's tricky. It's hard to crack down on some of that. But things like child pornography, snuff films, torture porn are largely illegal. You can limit the sale of violent video games like Grand Theft Auto. You can say you have to be 18 to buy it, but you can't ban people from buying it. You can't ban someone from walking into the store and buying a violent video game. So there's some limits, but you know, with pornography, if it's two consenting adults, you can't really do anything about it. That's completely allowed. Also with art, like art that some people would consider obscene, it's still protected by the First Amendment. You don't have to like it, but it is considered protected. Okay, any questions, comments? Any questions online? Okay, so 2 weeks from today, the paper proposal is online. I'm going to open a Dropbox tonight where you can submit it and post an example. All I need from you before the 24th is what you're writing the paper on, why you chose that topic, and 2 sources. So it doesn't have to be more than a paragraph. I'm just basically letting me know what you're writing on so I can be like, this is perfect, or let me help you narrow it down a little bit. That's the next big thing coming up, is the paper proposal. All right, so next Tuesday, we'll wrap up Chapter 4. We'll talk about other important amendments within the Bill of Rights and how we've expanded our rights. So of course, you guys will be online. So I'll see you guys next Thursday in class. If you have any questions over the weekend, feel free to email me or call or text my cell phone.